There's surely no movie genre that garners harsher reviews than horror movies. And to be fair, so many horror films are released each year that you can't entirely blame reviewers for having little patience for generic by-the-numbers slasher flicks. But at the same time, there are way too many great horror movies out there which were summarily eviscerated by the press upon original release. And with that in mind, I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 horror movies hated by critics, but loved by audiences. Number 10, Final Destination. The Rotten Tomatoes score, 36%. Final Destination genuinely might boast one of the most brilliantly original concepts in all of horror. That being a group of teenagers narrowly cheat death by departing a soon-to-explode plane after one of them experiences a premonition, prompting death itself to pick off those who escaped its clutches. All the same, critics were resoundingly frosty in their assessment of the flick, calling it stupid, badly acted, and comparing it derisively to TV shows like The Twilight Zone and The X-Files, which is a fitting critique given that screenwriter Jeffrey Reddick originally penned Final Destination as an X-Files script. And yet, the original FD was a huge hit with audiences, and still is today. The original made over 5 times its budget and kickstarted a franchise which led to 4 commercially successful yet critically dubious sequels. Almost 25 years on, wow, we are so old, from the original's release, though, it remains hugely popular as a campy, deliciously premised supernatural slasher, enough that a 6th film is currently in development. Number 9, Saw. All of them. Now, it might surprise you to hear that none of the Saw movies, not 1 out of the 9 currently released, are rated fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. Not even the seminal original managed to crack more than a 50% approval on the website, though you'd hopefully assume that retroactive critical opinion would be much better. Still, at the time, the installments were derided as mindless, artless torture porn, while on the other hand, fans generally enjoyed them and latched onto the high-stakes melodrama and deliciously twisty plots. So while pretty much every movie could be included on this list then, it's actually Saw 4 which has the biggest disparity between critical rating and online fan consensus. Rating just 18% with critics on the website, that drubbing pales compared to its 62% positive fan score. There were a few other surprises in here as well. I mean, honestly, I had no idea that Jigsaw was so well received by fans, with a stonkingly high 89% audience score compared to a 32% critic score. And hey, I think Jigsaw is a pretty decent movie, but that's a higher score than the original got. Sadly, my beloved Saw 6, though, genuinely one of the better Saw movies in my opinion, tanked with both audiences and critics. And seriously, that is a shame. Saw 6 rules. Number 8, Halloween 2, 2009. Rotten Tomatoes score, 23%. Rob Zombie's 2007 Halloween remake was already met with considerable scorn from critics at the time, netting a mere 28% approval rating, yet its sequel plumbed even lower. Reviewers felt that Zombie failed to meaningfully build upon his first outing with Halloween 2, and that the film was an unpleasant collision of pretentious storytelling choices and exhausting repetitive violence. Though the sequel was a box office disappointment at the time of its 2009 release, it has since earned itself a legion of loyal defenders, to the point that Halloween 2 is today upheld as something of a misunderstood cult classic. The horror community has largely turned around on Zombie's film, praising it for its bold straying from what fans expect of a Halloween movie, while delivering the single most brutal and terrifying depiction of Michael Myers on screen to date. It's not a pleasant movie to sit through by any means, but it is grimily effective and had something to say about generational trauma long before Hollywood made that trendy. Number 7, Silent Hill. Rotten Tomatoes score, 33%. Until the last few years, video game adaptations typically haven't fared that well with critics, like, at all, and even the better efforts struggle to make a dent with reviewers unfamiliar with the source material. Case in point, 2006's original Silent Hill was piled on by the press for being a well-made yet narratively incoherent and overlong attempt to translate the hit survival horror game to the big screen. And while critics honestly do kinda have a point about the arcane plot being relatively impenetrable for newcomers, in 2006, Silent Hill felt like a damn gift to gamers, a movie based on a video game with something approaching reverence for the style, tone, and story of the source material. And time has only been kind to it since. It was far from perfect for sure, but it got some serious brownie points for taking its inspiration so seriously and absolutely nailing the elements that mattered most. Number 6, House of Wax 2005. Rotten Tomatoes score 27%. Horror remakes, by their very nature, immediately invite low expectations from critics, which combined with the stunt casting of Paris Hilton in a major role, likely ensured that they couldn't muster much love for 2005's remake of the 1953 horror classic House of Wax. Reviewers rather flippantly dismissed it as yet another generic slasher remake amidst a growing pile of them, but it actually does stand out as one of the creepier and more atmospheric from that time. Between its grimy visuals, solid cast, and genuinely unnerving kills, there's a lot to like here. Enough that House of Wax now is generally held up as one of the stronger remakes of its period, and one that actually justifies its own existence. Though a few critics have revisited the film in recent years, those who have tend to skew way more positive, suggesting that the tide has finally turned in its favour. And yeah, again, it's not perfect, but the way this thing completely twists the premise of the original is definitely worth watching. Number 5, Event Horizon. Rotten Tomatoes score 33%. Critics haven't ever scored Paul W.S. Anderson's films well, and while generally, yeah, fair enough, they have a point, they're so off the mark with his 1997 sci-fi horror Event Horizon, it's kinda crazy. Now, reviewers largely condemned the film at the time as a largely style-over-substance exercise that was overly reliant on gratuitous violence, with many feeling that it sharply fell off a cliff after a solid opening sequence. Audiences of 1997 weren't particularly thrilled either, admittedly, with its brutal D+ cinema score and disastrous box office performance, whereby it failed to match its $60 million production budget. But Event Horizon fared much better on home video, where it quickly became a hot seller. And with word of mouth spreading and the tide turning, Event Horizon today is held up as a card-carrying cult classic. And nobody seems more thrilled about the film's re-evaluation than Anderson himself, who in a recent retrospective told Inverse, quote, "It's finally got the reaction now that I was hoping it would get 25 years ago. Filmmaking is a long race that you run, it's not all about the opening weekend." End quote. Number 4, Jason X. Rotten Tomatoes score 19%. Look, nobody was expecting critics to vibe with Friday the 13th in space, but 19%? Really? Even accepting that Jason X's far-flung sci-fi premise was simply too much for most critics to accept, they didn't have much kind to say at all about the plot, the characters, or overall script, feeling that it marked a desperate nadir for the struggling slasher series. And in fairness, at the time of Jason X's release, fans weren't hugely enamored with it either, with the film earning an unremarkable C cinema score and flopping at the box office. Yet, over the last 2+ decades, Jason X's esteem has steadily grown amongst the horror community, enough that many celebrate it today as a boldly bonkers, campy slasher classic, and even one of the better entries into the Friday the 13th series. In an era where audiences seem to be more accepting of wild what-if storytelling and alt-universe tales, it's easy to see why new generations of horror fans are considerably more accepting of this shaggy dog of a movie. Number 3, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2003. Rotten Tomatoes score 37%. As mentioned already, we were all pretty sick of horror remakes in the early to mid-2000s. Marcus Nispel's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre reboot, however, perhaps received too harsh of a kicking at the time, with critics absolutely slamming the movie's extreme violence and oppressive tone. In one of my favourite negative reviews of the film, the late great Roger Ebert even had this to say, quote, "The new version of The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a contemptible film, vile, ugly, and brutal. There is not a shred of reason to see it. Those who defend it will have to dance through mental hoops of their own devising, defining its meanness and despair as style or vision or a commentary on our world." End quote. And look, Roger Ebert was a way smarter man than I'll ever be, but vile, ugly, and brutal are the exact words I'd use to give a positive review of the TCM remake and describe why it's worth watching. From Ali Ermey's excellently menacing performance to supremely tense gore sequences, Nispel's film is a thoroughly horrible time in the best possible way. And recently it has enjoyed something of a reappraisal from horror fans, with the likes of Ryan Hollinger rating it as a hidden gem. Number 2, 13 Ghosts. Rotten Tomatoes score 18%. 2001's remake of 1960s horror film 13 Ghosts was panned into the ground by the press upon release, who fobbed it off as a soulless, pointless remake of a movie that, honestly, wasn't all that great to begin with. Yet, that's also precisely why 13 Ghosts, in all of its aggressively early aught style, stands out from the glut of horror remakes being produced of its era. And I know that might sound crazy when I've defended 3 of them, but look, over the 2000s, there were a lot, and there were a lot of bad ones. I mean, just look at those terrible Night of the Living Dead ones, or actually don't, save yourself. Anyway, without this one being hopelessly shackled to iconic, much-loved source material, director Steve Beck was able to truly let his freak flag fly. Sure, its frantic editing hasn't aged spectacularly well, but as haunted house movies go, this one has a lot going for it. Namely, some incredible production design for the focal house, and outstandingly gnarly gore effects, especially when a certain character gets cleaved in two by a sliding door. It moves fast, is unapologetically trashily gratuitous in regards to both gore and nudity, but it also has a great cast, running the gamut from Matthew Lillard to Oscar winner F. Murray Abraham, and smartly maximizes its bombastic style over its less assured narrative. 13 Ghosts was a quintessential gateway horror film for many young viewers in the early 2000s, myself included, and over 20 years later remains hugely watchable no matter what the critics at the time actually thought. Number 1. Urban Legend. Rotten Tomatoes score 25%. Of all the movies overdue a critical reevaluation on this list, there's perhaps none more deserving than 1998's Urban Legend. Reviewers at the time trashed it as a Scream knockoff attempting to cash in on the late 90s slasher resurgence, yet it honestly remains one of the most cleverly premised and intriguingly cast horrors of its era. For starters, the setup is killer. That being, a murderer is picking off college students in the style of classic urban legends. The kills are great, and the third act is absolutely wild. And again, its cast of young up-and-comers, including Jared Leto, Tara Reid, Michael Rosenbaum, and Joshua Jackson, is one of the most stacked of any slasher film of its period. Despite the tendency for post-Scream slashers to age pretty damn poorly, Urban Legend remains a terrifically entertaining romp to this day, and one which has consistently enjoyed stronger praise from viewers than critics. All the same, it feels like the movie is just waiting for a younger generation of reviewers to discover it and give that tomato meter score a much-needed boost. So that's our list. I want to see what you guys think down in the comments below. Do you think these horror movies deserved way more back in their day? And are there any others you think are worthy of a reappraisal now? Let me know, and while you're down there, if you could, please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to What Culture Horror for more lists like this on the regular. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.